So how many of you consider yourself to be adventurous? Oh boy, look at that. And what does it mean to be adventurous? Well, I'm a reference librarian, and so I decided to look up adventurous. Willing to take risks or try new experiences, for example, an adventurous traveler. Involving new ideas or methods, for example, they wanted more adventurous meals. How many of us have heard that? Full of excitement, for example, my life couldn't be more adventurous. Welcome to this evening's program, Scene by Sea, an appreciation of the New England coast, presented by local author Alison O'Leary. Alison is a journalist and outdoorswoman. She worked for newspapers from Austin, Texas to Reno, Nevada, as well as Bath, Maine, and is a Boston Globe West correspondent. She was a magazine editor and a publicist for other authors, and has won awards for writing and editing over the years, most notably for her history and travel writing. As an avid outdoorswoman, Alison's sense of adventure and love of all things New England inspired her 700-mile sailing trip, traveling from Providence, Rhode Island to Bar Harbor, Maine. And tonight, we, all of us, are fortunate to go along for the ride on her 25-foot sailboat. There it is, as she informs us about the small towns and secluded harbors on the New England coast, some history about the islands and lighthouses too, and entertains us with stories, both humorous and thrilling. Along with hiking New England's highest mountains, tearing down white-knuckle mountain bike trails, or sailing, Alison's enthusiasm for adventure is contagious, and just maybe her presentation will inspire you to plan one of your own. Please join me in warmly welcoming Alison O'Leary.
Thank you, Susan. Is this one out too? How's this?
Let me see. Huh. That one has a little bit of a delay.
Oh, that one sounds like a kickback on.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Hello?
A ghost in the machine. Thank you, Susan.
We always stay calm here in the Western Public Library.
That's right. There's a solution to everything.
Yeah.
So, my name is Alison O'Leary. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I am a local author. I've done a handful of outdoors books, travel, hiking, a guidebook for the Appalachian Mountain Club, and a couple of World War II history books that have kept me busy the last few years. But last summer, I had my lovely little sailboat at my disposal. She's 25 feet long. It's a Catalina brand sailboat. Catalinas are like the Chevy Novas of sailboats. They made 30,000 of them in the 70s and 80s, back when everybody had a sailboat. Everybody was out on the water. These days, not so much, but the boats are solid as can be, and this one at 37 years old is still hanging on and in good shape. So my partner John and I had some time on our hands, and John, being a school teacher, had the entire summer off, and he said, hey, let's do something fun. And I said, of course. What do you want to do? Let's take a trip in the boat. Sounds good. Where do you want to go? Let's just go. So I thought, hey, sure. I'll pack the cooler. Let's see where it takes us. So if you can see, the bottom of the screen there is Providence, and the red line starts here. We went from Providence through the Cape Cod Canal, Provincetown, and then just bumped up the coast until we found ourselves 350 miles later in Bar Harbor, Maine. It was 2 grown adults in a fairly small boat. 25 feet is not a lot of space. And poor John, need I mention? Of course, he's over 6 feet tall. So a boat this size had him crouching like this for 5 weeks. It we did it as a series of day trips, so it's very accessible. It didn't take any special technology or knowledge or even a ton of experience. I have some offshore experience. He had a boat in Lake Champlain years ago, so his ocean-going experience was rather limited. But you know, at some point you just got to jump in and go. So on day one, as I said, I had the cooler packed, we were all set, and I turned around and he's taking the engine apart. I said, sweetie, like, what are you doing? Well, come on, Allison, he's a math teacher. He is a precise person, and I'm the loosey-goosey, you know, left-brained, artsy type person. And he said, I want to make sure this thing works. I said, we've been using it for months. Yeah, but not out in the ocean offshore for weeks at a time. Okay, fine, take your time, do whatever you need to do. He put it back together. We got a later start than it planned, but we got that great afternoon breeze. Now, in New England, we get typical southwesters. So in June, July, August, the wind is coming out of the southwest, blowing toward the northeast. And in the afternoons in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, it really kicks up. On this particular day, we had quite some breeze. I mean, for a small boat like mine with full sail, when the wind gets above 14, 15 knots, you're tipping pretty good and you're flying right along. However, on this particular day, you can see by my little map over here on the left side, we were doing great. The yellow line is the track of our boat. We get to here, and the wind was basically saying, you're not going any further than this. We were tacking back and forth, and we're not making any headway south. So we had this gorgeous sunset, furled the sails, and said, okay, we're going to try again tomorrow. So we went into a little harbor there on the west side of Narragansett Bay called Allen's Harbor. And in the morning, of course, gorgeous, you know, woke up, it's just absolutely placid and beautiful. But it got the wheels turning in my head. I said, this is not your average New England harbor. This is a tiny little salt pond that has been dredged into a harbor, and I wonder why that is. So I did a little research on Narragansett Bay and World War II. As I said, I'm a World War II author, and discovered that here's a map of Narragansett Bay. I'm sorry, the printing is pretty fuzzy. During World War II, there were quite a number of naval installations, particularly in the southern third of Narragansett Bay. It's 40 miles from Providence to Newport. So here was a naval torpedo base for anti-submarine warfare, Quonset Naval Air Station, Davisville here in North Kingstown, which was home of the Navy Seabees, and Newport Naval War College. We spent some time here by the torpedo boat basin and learned that over 14,000 Navy sailors were trained in these PT boats in stopping enemy submarines in particular, but also enemy ships. One of them is a very familiar name to all of us, John F. Kennedy. Remember PT 109 and how it was blown out of the water by an enemy ship in the Pacific, and he barely escaped with his life. Southern Rhode Island looked like this in 1941 and 1942 as they were getting the crews up and running and getting them ready to go to war. Both of my World War II books are about German submarines and how absolutely deadly they were and how hard they were for the Allies to actually stop. They were sinking a ship a day off the east coast of the United States for the first 6-7 months of 1942. A ship a day. And we managed to sink one German submarine in that period of time. So these torpedo boats were sorely needed, but I'm afraid that by the time they had them up and running and the crews all trained, it was a little late for the East Coast. They ended up going out into the Pacific. So day 2, we were just off of Newport, Rhode Island, out in the ocean finally. Sails are up, the wind is blowing, it was gorgeous. And John said, I heard something. I think something jumped into the dinghy. I said, what are you, crazy? We're pulling this 8-foot rubber dinghy behind the boat as our way to get to shore when we were on a mooring. And I looked back and I said, oh my goodness, there is a shark in our dinghy. How lucky are we? Like, this whole trip must be doomed in some way. And the darn thing was chewing the daylights out of the entire boat, everything in the boat. It tore up a life jacket, it ate part of an oar, it was just ripping it to shreds. And we thought, you're not happy about being in the dinghy, we're not happy about hosting you in the dinghy. Thank goodness that John is so tall and has such long arms, because after a couple of hours, honestly, of wrangling this thing, he ended up just pulling the dinghy next to the boat, reaching and grabbing it by the tail, and pulling it out. I made a video of as much of the footage as I could get while I was trying to steer the boat, and it's on my website, or there's a link to it on my website. But this would be a theme of our entire summer trip. It was our calling card, because I put that picture on social media on a sailing group, and I said, does anyone in Maine know how to repair a dinghy with approximately 10,000 little holes in it? And the picture went viral. So more about that in a moment. We ended up sheltering at Kittery Island that night. It was sort of a short hop, not the great sailing day we envisioned. Kittery is the southernmost of the Elizabeth Islands. We came from Newport. It's just a few hours to get there and drop anchor. Of course, no chance of going ashore with a dinghy that is full of holes and sinking. We had pulled it up onto the deck of the boat at that point. So there are 13 Elizabeth Islands in total, and they create a barrier between Martha's Vineyard and the New Bedford area of the South Shore of Massachusetts. Kittery was actually settled briefly by Englishmen long before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth. There's a tiny island here next to Kittery called Pennakees, which has hosted a leper colony and a juvenile rehabilitation school. And there's a great book about the juvenile school called Castaways by George Cadwallader. He was one of a couple of Vietnam veterans back in the late 70s, early 80s who devised this program to teach young men who were on the wrong path in life to learn carpentry skills and farming and things like that on this tiny island. And the book is really interesting, some of the insights about the effectiveness of the program, and I won't give away any answers, any of the ending. Bartholomew Gosnold was the man who came from England originally in 1602 and explored Cape Cod and the islands before, as I said, before the Pilgrims came to Plymouth. He actually named Martha's Vineyard for his daughter, Martha. He had a group of men go ashore, they found grapes, therefore vineyard. I guess that was easy because he was the only white person in sight and didn't know that it might have another name. He settled his group on Kittery Island. It only lasted a couple of months. I imagine that when those cold winds started blowing down Buzzards Bay in October, November, they said, okay, boss, let's get out of here. This is not going to be fun for winter. So he went back to England and ended up captaining another ship down to Jamestown, Virginia, where there was already a settlement, and living the rest of his life there. He is far better known in Jamestown than he is on Cape Cod. Few people are familiar with his name. So then we went into Onset, which is a little village outside of Wareham, Mass., and John proceeded to attempt to repair all 9,000 holes in the dinghy. You can see these little incision marks. There were so many of them. And for 2 of the hottest days of July, he patiently applied rubber cement and patches and tried to hold them on there long enough to take. But unfortunately, the dinghy would not hold air. We did meet a tremendous number of people walking on the docks, and they would say, "What are you doing? Like, what are you, crazy, sitting here in the sun working on this project when you could be swimming or enjoying, a beer or something?" And we'd tell them the story, and they'd say, "Really, show us pictures." So I would show them pictures and the videos, and word got out a little further that we were the people with the shark in the dinghy. So then it was on to the Cape Cod Canal. You can see the dinghy here rolled up on the foredeck of the boat. We hadn't quite given up because that social media post that went on the sailing group and it elicited a response from a man who said, "I'll buy that boat." I said, "What are you, crazy? Okay, you want to buy it from us so that we'll make a little bit of money toward buying another dinghy," which really was not in the budget for this trip. And then we went to Provincetown, Mass, where, as I've talked about the Pilgrims were originally settling here in Provincetown. And that is why the Pilgrim Monument stands on the tallest hill in town. It's 242 feet tall, and we learned recently that it is the tallest all-granite monument in the United States. The Washington Monument is not all granite, and the Bunker Hill Monument is not as tall as 242 feet. So they claim the Pilgrims as settlers here in Provincetown. I think that the tower is a lot more impressive than that little rock in Plymouth. Don't you agree? Provincetown has a great maritime history to it. Lots of boats in the harbor, lots of excursion boats you can take, and it's all about the ocean. And so Macmillan Wharf has so many opportunities for you to go out and enjoy it. Plenty of fishermen in the area, and of course, the land-based shenanigans, all of the parades and the parties and shows that go on in P-Town in the summertime. It makes it so much fun. We love stopping there. And also in P-Town is the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. These are the people who tag great white sharks and then track them and study them to see how they interact with the Cape Cod environment. They have actually tagged 300,000 from 50 different species since 1962, 34 in 2023 alone. So the tags that they put on them ping off of buoys so that you have an idea of where certain sharks are if they're near the buoys. I have friends who have the app on their phones, and they're always saying, "Where are you right now? Are you out sailing? There's a shark out there." And I say, "Listen, calm down. We just assume there's always going to be sharks out there. And we are in their habitat." We tried to visit and find out more about the shark who jumped into our dinghy, but unfortunately they were closed the afternoon that we were there. So then we moved on, heading toward Gloucester. And unfortunately, this is a sailor's worst nightmare. You have beautiful weather and dead, flat, calm conditions. No wind whatsoever, but also no waves. So that 9.9 horse engine, thank goodness John had tuned it up, ran all day long as we crossed from Provincetown all the way to Gloucester. It was about 50 miles. Lots of time to play cribbage in the cockpit. We had an accompanying armada of dragonflies, which I thought was so neat. They just zoomed around the boat and landed on us and landed on the rigging and then would take off again. And of course, we crossed through a corner of Stellwagen Bank, which is an area of the ocean that is tens of thousands of square miles and of a national marine sanctuary. It was created by George Bush in 1992. And I wasn't really able to tell from my brief research what exactly is prohibited, what makes it a sanctuary. The only thing I could see was that they don't allow commercial fishing boats to drag the bottom. So that was the prohibition that jumped out at me when I was reading some of the literature. And I think that allows the ecology there to flourish, and therefore that's where all the whales are. So that black smear, I apologize, this is just a phone camera image. The black smear was a whale, and we saw many of them that afternoon, and almost every time I cross Stellwagen Bank, I see whales out there, but not so much in other places. So there's something truly special about a national marine sanctuary. So when we started to see Gloucester in the distance, it was interesting to me that there would be two lighthouses about a quarter of a mile apart, because there's a 2,200-foot breakwater between them. The one on the east is a Coast Guard station with your average lighthouse that blinks once every 3 seconds maybe. And at the other end of the breakwater, at the entrance to the harbor, is this weird-looking lighthouse that stands on tall legs. And I was like, I wonder why they made them so different. And then it dawned on me that if you're arriving in the evening, you need to know the difference so that you don't end up trying to cut in between them. So if you know where one lighthouse is, you'll look for the next one, and then you know you're at the entrance to the harbor. Of course, today with all of our high-tech navigation apps and equipment on boats, it's much easier to just know where you are. You don't need the visual cues all the time. But that light at the entrance of the harbor is called an occulting light. And that one is on more than it is off. So this one may blink every 2 seconds, every 3 seconds. This light will stay on for 3 seconds and then off for 1 second, then on for 3 seconds and off for 1 second. So you're absolutely clear about where you are between the lighthouses entering Gloucester Harbor. And it's a giant harbor. Here are the lighthouses. Well, the Coast Guard station here and the entrance to the harbor there. It's more than 1.25 miles to get all the way up into the inner harbor following our yellow path there. And as we crossed through the outer harbor, I looked up on the shore, rising from the trees on the west side was a castle, which I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Why would there be a castle in Gloucester, Massachusetts? Well, it was built in the 1920s by an eccentric inventor named John Hammond, who was actually holder of many, many patents for radio-controlled technology, which I'm sure was used for things like missiles and torpedoes, various other applications for it. But he thought it was pretty neat to build a castle for himself. He collected many objects of art, and when he passed away, the castle became part of a trust. I believe it may be a trustees of reservations property, and libraries often have passes for trustees and other historic properties to visit. It is open to the public. They have special events there, and you can also rent the castle for a special event. This is not the castle. This is a park in downtown Gloucester, right near the harbor. Gloucester has both sort of a rugged, gritty, commercial fishing side and a rather pretty, interesting, artsy side. And this is part of the pretty, interesting, artsy side, this gorgeous park right in the center of town. When I visited, I noticed it's called Fitzhugh Lane Park. And up here on the rock overlooking the harbor is this statue of Fitzhugh Lane, who was a painter who lived in the Gloucester, Cape Ann area from the mid-1800s to the late 1800s. And he was kind of a local character, an interesting guy who painted the ships in the harbor all the time. And he had a little bit of a sense of humor about it. If you go to the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, many of his paintings are hanging there, and there's a little scavenger hunt to find the sea serpents that he has added to his pictures, because there was a local legend that there were sea serpents in the water. Maybe that was to keep the kids from being too adventurous. Keep them closer to home, the sea serpents will get you. He painted them into many of his beautiful paintings of ships in the harbor, and it's lots of fun to go see. Cape Ann Museum is also a beautiful art museum. They had an Edward Hopper exhibit last summer. I wish I had gotten there, but I was out sailing. So if you go to this building at the top of the park and look to the north, you'll see this Our Lady of Good Voyages church off to the north. And she's actually up with the steeples, cradling a ship in her arms. And it's one of those churches where the seafaring residents of Gloucester would go say their prayers before they went out fishing for many days, or maybe sailing on a trip, who knows. But it's mentioned in Sebastian Junger's book, The Perfect Storm. This particular church is, and the interesting, unique steeple as well. Elsewhere in Gloucester, as we explored the town, we enjoyed an authentic Italian bakery, some cappuccino, and some goodies. We wandered into a shop that had Wicked Tuna video games. You remember when Wicked Tuna became a TV show? I looked at it, I said, who on earth would watch people fish? I mean, that's like watching people golf. It's so boring, and you couldn't even describe how boring it would be. But the characters on that show, the local guys, really made it funny. I would flip through every now and then just to listen to them talk on the radio to one another, and it was very funny. This was our view in the evening, artistically rendered, of course, to sort of blur out the commercial fishing docks there. But it can be a very interesting town. They have a lot going on up there. They have schooner festivals, very much a maritime town. And when I went out on deck to have my coffee in the morning, I saw these gentlemen coming by rowing an old wooden dinghy, an old wooden dory, different kind of boat entirely. And one guy looked at the name of my boat and said, I had a goat named Esmeralda once. And his friend said, and he ate it. I thought, okay, welcome to Gloucester. And then this gentleman floated by very serenely in his tiny little, I don't remember if that's a junk rig or what that rig exactly is, but the sailboat was no bigger than this table. And he's sipping his coffee and just cruising through the harbor. It was really neat. So our next leg was to leave Gloucester. We actually had sailing this day, come out around Cape Ann and go all the way up to the New Hampshire-Maine line at Kittery. And along the way, we saw this crazy island offshore. Thacker Island has 2 lighthouses on it. I kept rubbing my eyes and looking and saying, 2 lighthouses? Why? Why? As a journalist, it's my business to be nosy. So I had to look it up. And it turns out that the British actually built the 2 lighthouses prior to the American Revolution. This island was such a nuisance to ships traveling up and down the coast. People kept running into it. So they figured, well, if 1 lighthouse isn't enough, we'll put another one up and maybe you won't run into it. There were lots of wrecks here. So the funny part of the story is, around the time of the American Revolution, the Gloucester militia, who might have been in a tavern having a few cups of grog at the time, decided, darn those British, they put those 2 lighthouses there so that they knew where our towns were to come raid us. We'll show them. They went up to Thacker Island and they demolished both lighthouses. They were rebuilt in the 1800s, and then around 1930, during the Great Depression, there wasn't enough oil to light both lighthouses, so they had to shut one off. And then the history gets more interesting. You can see from these old pictures that the lighthouses and the island were a part of the local culture. Little did they know who would be moving in the 1960s. This guy's name was Joe the Animal Barboza. He was a very bad guy. He was part of the mob. He was a hitman for the mob in Boston in the 1950s and 60s, and he was a real nut job. I've read a little bit about him. The FBI needed to hide him somewhere so that he could testify against the mob in federal court in Boston in the 1960s. So they hid him at the lighthouse at Thacker Island. And they would use a lobster boat to come pick him up, take him down through the bay to Boston, unload him, take him to court, and then hide him out again at night on the island. He was the first person in the witness protection program ever. Isn't that interesting? He did not meet a very nice end. Enough said. So now moving up a little bit, we landed in Kittery, Maine, coming up the Piscataqua River, which divides New Hampshire on this side and Maine on that side. This big river has quite a ripping current. I thought it might be a little too much for my 9.9 horse outboard, but we persevered. John was very patient with me, pointing out all of the buoys all the way up the path, and we ended up in a mooring field directly up this line. And then, whew, I said, okay, we did it. We're in Maine, we can go home now. And he said, have you heard about Acadia National Park? There's hiking up there. And I said, but John, this is a lot of sailing. This is a lot of being on the boat. He wanted to keep going. But while we were in the neighborhood, we took a little look around and realized what historic place the Piscataqua River is. So right on the banks of the river is this fortress. It was called Fort William and Mary. Originally, it was built in 1630 by the British, and it was designed to protect the local residents when the Native Americans went on the warpath. Of course, the Native Americans, abetted by the French, were trying to drive the colonists back out of New England, maybe all the way back to England, but the British gave them places to hide out and wait out those Indian raids, and this is one. It's now called Fort Constitution. It was rebuilt for, I believe, the War of 1812 and refortified. It is currently under renovation, so not able to be visited at this time. The seal of the state of New Hampshire kind of surprised me. It has a ship on it. I mean, how much of New Hampshire is really related to shipping or water? It's like most of the state is mountains and quarries and things like that. They only have 12 miles of shoreline, and yet this river and that shoreline was so important to the founding of the state that they put the ship on the state seal. It's called the USS Raleigh. It was built for the United States for the Revolutionary War. We used it to fight against the British. Unfortunately, in very short order, the British captured the ship and used it against us. It still ended up on the state seal. That's optimism for you. If you look up the river a little bit, you'll see this huge fortress-looking building. That is part of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The shipyard was started in 1800 by Admiral Farragut, the father of the U.S. Navy, and that's where they built a lot of frigates for wartime, for the Treasury Department, and over time they changed their manufacturing to submarines. So they built most of the submarines used in World War I and World War II here at the Naval Shipyard. And actually in 1945, 4 German submarines at the end of the war after Germany had surrendered, 4 German submarines surrendered themselves to the Naval Shipyard here. And I actually met a man who has been associated with the shipyard since he was 17 years old. He's 96. He remembers those submarines coming in, and he said we would go over them with a fine-tooth comb to see if they had technology that we were unaware of, something that we could adapt to American submarines. And I said, oh, that must have been so cool. He said, it was amazing. And I said, well, why didn't you get them to save any of them? You know, put one in a museum. There is exactly one German submarine in the United States from World War II, and it's in Chicago. And he said, no, they dragged them all out to sea and used them for target practice. So that was the end of that. But this roundhouse here was a munitions depot for the War of 1812. Very interesting, you see a lot of War of 1812 fortresses from New Hampshire north because the British actually held much of Maine captive during the War of 1812, something I had never heard of before. That building is called Fort McClary, and it is on the Kittery side of the river. So our next stop was Biddeford Pool. Why I chose Biddeford Pool, I cannot tell you. I could have chosen this very easy route up there in the upper left that takes you right into the town of Biddeford, but no, I had to choose the difficult one that required us to navigate all of these rocks and little islands and then come in through this skinny gut and land in like 2 tablespoons of water there in Biddeford Pool, in the dark, of course. And so it was a nerve-wracking evening for us. This is the Navionics navigation map of coming through that very skinny gut with a very fast current and grabbing the mooring there. In Biddeford Pool, we learned a lot about the nearby islands. This one was marked with a 132-foot tall granite post because, again, people were running aground on it, and the map makers decided, geez, if they don't understand, you know, where the islands are, we're going to plant a marker on this one so that they remember. It's called Stage Island, and the channel to get into the pool goes directly at the island and then turns left. Down here is a picture of Wood Island, which is the outer island looking out at the ocean. And up in the upper left is very interesting fish. We were on our mooring. As I said, it was starting to get dark, and I could hear this splash, splash, splash. I said, what the heck is going on out there, John? Something is feeding, some fish is out there jumping. We had no idea. We could never see it. We could hear it. So I asked a guy who was fishing the next day, I said, what is the fish out here jumping around? And he said, it's a sturgeon. Amazing that they were thought to be extinct, but once we started to take dams out of the rivers, these fish, which require spawning in native fresh water and then live their lives at sea and come back to spawn again in the fresh water, there was a resurgence in their population, and so they're being found in many of the harbors up and down New England. And this is a peek inside Biddeford Pool Yacht Club, which I love to show people because a lot of people think that yacht clubs are very stuffy and formal, but this is just a comfortable, welcoming place where you can sit and read a magazine and be in a chair that's not rocking back and forth for a while. It's a funny feeling. We went around the corner to have some blueberry pie at a local restaurant, and this was on the wall. Now this absolutely made my blood run cold. We were heading further into Maine, and from previous experience, I knew that Maine would be full of lobster pots. Those beautiful, colorful buoys that people like to hang on their mailboxes or on their fence posts. When they're in the water, they just strike terror into the hearts of sailors. And this tells us that there are 3 million lobster pots in Maine waters. 3 million! I thought, oh my goodness, John, why are we going into Maine? This is crazy. Why would we do it? But it's the adventure of it all. So as we got further up into Portland, we passed Portland Headlight and then Fort Gorges, which is really in downtown Portland on the waterfront. It was built for the Civil War. By the time it was completed, it was absolutely obsolete. So anyone with a kayak is welcome to paddle over there and explore it, check it out. There are a couple similar forts up and down the coast of Maine. Lots of islands in Portland. I had actually lived in Maine some years ago, was totally unaware of the beauty of Portland Harbor and all of the many islands with little communities on them. It's wonderful sailing up in there. And of course, there's fabulous World War II history. All of these little islands had some sort of bunkers or radio towers or listening devices for submarines on them during World War II. Last summer, in fact, I read a story in the Boston Globe that a couple who was getting married and was hoping to have an outdoor wedding found that their weather forecast was not positive for having an outdoor wedding. So they switched it up and they got married in a bunker on one of the islands, an old World War II bunker, decorated it, and that's truly a unique event. So Portland's past is rooted in fishing. There were fishing camps up and down the Maine coast well before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, and they didn't change much over the years. Here are people mending nets down here. These long tables are where the fish would be drying. So they would take cod and cut out the fillets and let it dry outdoors for several days before packaging it up and selling it. We actually bought some salt cod this summer, hoping that it would be a tasty dinner. It's truly, truly salty. And you gotta remember, 12 hours of soaking just to reconstitute it so that you can actually eat it. Otherwise, it's like eating a table. So the story behind Maine's lobster is very interesting. Lobster used to be a vermin that people in Maine never touched. I grew up across the street from a woman who was from Maine who would tell us, oh, lobster, we only feed that to livestock and inmates. And I was like, wow, really? She would absolutely never touch lobster. But there were some entrepreneurs back in the late 1800s who recognized the missed opportunity there. They could see all the fish being collected in Maine and all of those lobsters just going untouched. So they started paying fishermen. I think it was $1 per 100 lobsters, taking them to the canneries, canning them into, attractive looking food cans here, and selling it as a delicacy on the trains that went from New York to San Francisco across the country. So people got a taste of Maine lobster, and then they were clamoring for it. And so they developed that entire industry sort of just on a whim, or strategically, if you think that way. I'm not an entrepreneur, so as we move further up into Maine, we start to see so many lighthouses. I mean, there was one on every rock and ledge, and it was just like, why? Again, the nosy journalist in me wanted to know why there are so many lighthouses in Maine. Why aren't there so many in Massachusetts on Cape Cod? There are some, but not this many. And when I did some research, it turns out it was for the timber industry. That back prior to 1800, the British Navy would send people up into the woods in Maine and mark trees for the king. So they were called king pines. And if they had that special seal on them, nobody else could cut down that tree because they wanted the tallest and the straightest lumber for the king's navy. So over time, people started to recognize, hey, we have virgin forests and we have big rivers here. Put the two together and you create an incredible industry. And in fact, between 1820 and 1860, Bangor, Maine was the timber capital of the world. They used the Penobscot, the Androscoggin, and the Kennebec rivers to float all of this cut wood down to ships or to sawmills where it was made into boards first and then loaded aboard ships and taken for all of the industries that would need wood. And in that period of time, they turned out 9 trillion board feet of lumber. 9 trillion. So a board foot is about the size of a laptop, but the number is just absolutely staggering. So they would cut the wood in the wintertime, leave it on the shores of the rivers. When the snow melted and the water came up, it was easy to push the cut timbers into the water and float them down. And of course you had the roughnecks, a lot of them being French Canadians. They did wear little spikes on their shoes, I learned. I always thought that they just had boots on and they were incredibly lucky. But they had little spikes on their shoes and they would walk out onto all of that timber floating downstream and keep it moving till it got to the right ships. So along the way, we also stopped at the Hermit Island campground. This is in Phippsburg, so the Kennebec River is over here, Fort Popham. Hermit Island was created just after World War II by a governor of Maine named George Sewell, who had grown up in the area, went to war, came back, as I said, became governor. He decided that people needed a beautiful place to recreate and enjoy the Maine waterfront, and so he created this island. It is still in his family. My significant other, his family came here to camp when he was a kid. He took his kids there, and now we visit the grandchildren when they're camping at Hermit Island. It's really a beautiful spot. And if you have a small boat, you see just above Hermit Island it says Small Point. You can go in behind Hermit Island and discover an entire fishing community back there that is invisible otherwise, unless you have a boat and a way to get back there. It's really neat. It's tucked in behind the island, so it's well protected, has deep water, and is really just gorgeous to look at, just, picturesque Maine. So in the Kennebec River, just up at Fort Popham, again, Fort Popham was built for the Civil War in the 1860s. It's 30 feet tall and the walls are like 8 feet thick. It was never really used for defensive purposes, but it might have been a little later because the Bath Iron Works is just upstream in the town of Bath. Bath Iron Works started out as a ship chandler, so they would build little pieces for ships, whether it was pulleys or rudders or something like that. And over time, the business grew until they were building entire ships. During World War II, they built a destroyer every 2.5 weeks. Just unbelievable to me, because even now, this part of Maine isn't that developed. And so all I could think of is, where did they get the people to work around the clock for weeks on end to create destroyers? I mean, they're huge, intricate ships, but they did it, where there's a will, there's a way, and they still build these destroyers. These are called Arleigh Burke class destroyers. This one was just launched this year from Bath Iron Works. The odd looking one up there is called a Zumwalt class destroyer. That's a few years old, and I understand that the design of it was meant to evade enemy detection. Not real sure about that, but it certainly is unique. And as we made our way up the coast, we certainly encountered a lot of fog. It is typical of Maine in the summertime, as the air gets warm and the water is cold. You get these periods where you could be sailing past an island and not even know it's there unless you're looking at your chart or your navigation app. And, at times it was a little bit hairy, but fortunately we have buoys that you can sort of follow paint by number. You just go from one to the next, right up the coast until you find your harbor of choice. And a really fun place to stop is Booth Bay Harbor, of course. We ran into a nasty little pirate. That's my granddaughter, Alice. It was regatta weekend, so they have a big boat parade and a lot of hoopla around sailing, a lot of races, lots of fun. Booth Bay Harbor is a place where people from the Boston area and New York first started taking summer vacations back in the 1860s, 1870s, when people started to have a little extra money on hand and could, they weren't held down to a farm per se. They were business people. So they would get on steamships and go from Boston to Portland to Booth Bay with big trunks full of these fancy Victorian clothes and stay for the entire summer. Build a little cottage or maybe one of those big cottages, but they created these summertime communities up there and went back year after year. Some of the men up in the upper left-hand corner would join organizations like the Knights of Pythias, which is a fraternal organization that did good deeds around the town, and they built this beautiful clubhouse here in the lower left, which is still standing as the Booth Bay Harbor Opera House. Now here's what the locals did. They ran the ships, they did the fishing, and they ran the canneries to feed all of these people who came into Maine for vacation and for fun. And of course, it definitely aided the Maine economy significantly, and people were able to move up a little bit, I believe. And by the end of World War II, lots of artists were flocking to Maine. This is an area in particular where they gathered, the Port Clyde and Tennant's Harbor area, just up the coast from Booth Bay Harbor. And this house is still owned by one of the descendants of the Wyeths. Andrew Wyeth is a famous painter of scenes from Maine. The evergreen trees, the rocky cliffs, the beautiful waves crashing into the shore, was made famous right in this area. So then we crossed Penobscot Bay from Tennant's Harbor, past Saddleback Lighthouse, over to this little island here called Isle aux Hauts. And it was named by the French fishermen because it had a little bit of elevation to it, so isle with a hill. Of course, it was occupied by Native Americans long before the European fishermen showed up, but it is only lightly settled. There are only maybe 50 homes in the northern part of the island, and the southern part of the island has been part of Acadia National Park since the 1940s. So that's where we chose to go, and we really had it to ourselves. It was fabulous. There are 5 campsites there that you can reserve and go stay at. You don't need your own boat. You can catch a boat out of the town of Stonington. It runs twice a day. It's called a mail boat. It goes to the national park in the summertime twice a day and to the downtown wharf at least once a day all year round. So we explored miles and miles of hiking trails. These views just never get old. It was spectacular, and as I said, I think we ran across maybe 2 people the whole day. And then we got back into the boat, and you could see, now I'm not crazy, look at all of these lobster pots lining my path here. You had to try and sail and avoid them or suffer the consequences. We finally made it all the way up to Booth Bay Harbor, which, to my surprise, is not such a quaint little Maine town. It is quite busy with cruise ships. In July, there was just the one hiding behind Porcupine Island there, but in September, there are apparently 2 or 3 at a time disgorging 8,000 to 10,000 people into this little town, and all I could think of was, can't imagine the lines for lobster rolls, It must be crazy. But it is a lovely town just the same. We did the hike that John wanted to do. We went up Cadillac Mountain that overlooks the harbor. My boat is sort of in the direction of that cruise ship out there. Just spectacular. But we got to the top huffing and puffing and realized that you could have taken a bus. They have a road that goes all the way to the top of the mountain. There's a wonderful bus transit system there in Acadia National Park that services many of the surrounding towns. Highly recommended. Always runs on time, clean, friendly people. We went back this year again, and it was just fabulous. So then we had to turn around and go home. And as I said, the wind blows southwest to northeast, so guess what? Day one was like, oh no, we have to go into the wind the whole way home. So the 350 miles on the way up there would be multiplied to get home because you have to sort of tack through the wind. Now I will be finishing in just a few slides. Want to give you the highlights. The best sailing day was the worst day for my phone. It went overboard. 90 feet of water, never to be seen again. Very unfortunate. But then we went into the town of Stonington. Now, Isle of Ho is a little bit south of Stonington. Each one of the circles on this map of Stonington was a granite quarry. And the entire landscape is just pockmarked with them. There were over 150 active in Maine at one time. So not quite rivaling the timber industry, but amazing just the same, because think about it. I mean, moving a piece of wood is a little bit different than moving a huge hunk of rock. Granite is, I want to say, 32 times stronger than steel. Of course, you can't bend it and make it into different shapes so much, but it was so useful for buildings back in the day that it was put aboard ships and sent all over the East Coast for buildings and curbstones and all sorts of purposes. Excuse me. There is a wonderful outdoor museum at the site of one of the quarries. It's called the Settlement Quarry Preserve, just northeast of Stonington. This is a view from it. It has little plaques that explain the quarrying process, and some of that Maine granite ended up in the Philadelphia Mint. Another place was John F. Kennedy's tombstone, picked specifically by his widow for the way that the light plays on the rock. And as I said, I'll wrap this up quickly. We left Stonington and we're heading hopefully for Port Clyde, and looked sort of to the west and said, that doesn't look so good. You know, the blue sky is turning dark. What should we do? Well, then we looked to the north toward Rockland, and there was a boat completely surrounded by rain clouds. And it became apparent that we needed to change our route just a little bit, because this cloud was over Port Clyde, which was our intended destination, and we really didn't want to mess with it. So we started the engine and we changed direction, and then this cloud collapsed. And it sent a huge gust of wind at us, pushed the boat over on its side, made us go really fast for like 20 seconds. It was exciting. And then it was gone. And this is what was left of the cloud. It had rolled across the sky and it was like a rope on the horizon. It was really cool. I mean, it was scary as heck, but it was really cool. So this is how we had to divert. This was our planned route. We ended up on this little tiny island called Matinicus, which I believe has about 30 homes on it. And again, just part of the adventure. You have to be able to do plan B if plan A is not working. So that's where I'll end my talk. Thank you so much for being a nice audience. This was roughly the rest of the route on the way home, and we arrived safely. So as I said in the beginning, this isn't meant to convert anyone to sailing, but simply to give you an idea of what's out there. You know, if you can put together the time off and find your own adventure, you're going to have some great stories and really enjoy it. Does anyone have any questions? No questions. Yes, ma'am.
I'm intrigued by the shark that made its way onto your dinghy. Did you see it flop on?
John heard it. He heard it land.
Was something pursuing it, do you think, or?
We don't think so. I actually wrote an article. I actually wrote 3 articles about it for different magazines. And I talked to a shark expert who said that is a short fin mako. and they are the fastest fish in the ocean. They go 60 miles an hour when they feel like it, and sometimes they just jump. I said, do you think we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Did he survive his ordeal?
In fact, he did.
Wow.
John pulled him out, as I said,
So I heard
grabbed
you
him by the tail,
say-
got him over the edge,
And he swam away.
and he swam away.
That's wild.
Lives to terrorize another sailor another day.
How many feet do you think it was?
It was roughly the size of not quite this big, probably 3.5, 4 feet.
Now, one part I
Uh-huh.
maybe didn't pay attention to. How did you get your dinghy replaced? If it was no longer viable,
Yeah.
you said your dinghy to.
Yeah, we did sell the original Holy Dinghy,
Right.
which we nicknamed Chewy, or Shark Bait or something. We got $50 for it. And then I went online to my sailing community and I said, is anybody selling a used dinghy? I don't have a big budget. And a friend of a friend had one that we were able to pick up and take for the rest of the trip.
So you replaced it with a rubber dinghy again?
Exactly the same. They're hard to avoid. They're lightweight and easy to pull behind a boat.
Got it.
So,
Got it.
yeah, basically exactly the same. So, well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much for coming tonight. If anyone is interested in a book, or please sign up for my occasional emails when I have a new book coming out or something worthy of announcing. So, thanks again, folks. Have a nice night.